Hello and welcome to another Matters Rising presentation. Just going to do a quick look at some of the myths of the Easter Rising and looking at artillery in this particular presentation. So I had a question in the Matters Rising quiz set 1 about the 4 18-pounder artillery pieces that came to Dublin. They came from Athlone, where there was a training barracks camp with about 3 different batteries, transported by train over to Dublin. Only brought 4 of the guns. There was 8 old pieces. Bit of poor condition, had to do a bit of messing about to get them across to Dublin, but they arrived, worked in twos, different parts of the city, creating a bit of mayhem and havoc. I'll start off by just saying I'm not an artilleryman. My experience is limited to sitting on the artillery piece outside Enniscorthy Castle as a kid, and then as a youngster getting into airfigs. And I think my first introduction was probably this kit, which is to do with the Royal Horse Artillery, who used 13-pounder guns, so slightly smaller than the Royal Field Artillery, who used the 18-pounder. Setup very similar. There would be a set of 6 horses with a limber carrying a gun. There would be a detachment senior NCO, a separate horse, 3 men on horses, 2 on the limber, and then be another group of 4 looking after another wagon and ammunition, tools, etc. So there is terminology here that probably an artillery person would wince and scream at, but I'll apologise for that. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. So this is the type of artillery piece that would have been used in Dublin. It's got 2 wheels, as you can see there, a barrel here at the bottom of 2 round objects. The top object is used to capture some of the recoil and prevent the artillery piece moving backwards when the shells were fired. Not quite sure how that worked, but you know, it's appeared to. It's one of 2 items here. Ammunition would be loaded into the breech here. You can see that it's got a long tail, at the end of which is something called a spade, and then there is a hook here for attaching the artillery piece to the limber. And the limber, you can see, has probably got probably sticking out here some ammunition, space and tools, etc., and some seating space for some of the crew. With this tail piece here, you can see that there isn't much room for the breech to depress, so you can't really raise the barrel up very high to lob shells over buildings, etc. In the same way that you've got some mortars in the background here, they could quite high elevation. This is quite a flat elevation. You could increase that elevation by digging a hole, put the spade in, etc. And you'd also use this to reduce some of the recoil. That would be useful for when you've sighted up a gun on a target. If you can keep the piece in situ as much as possible, then the sighting is ready. Put in another shell, fire, it's more or less on the same target. If you allow the recoil to move the gun around, you've got to reset every time. And with this type of gun, the crew would actually have visibility of what they were firing on. There was no firing over buildings, there was no firing over hills, etc. You shot at what you could see. Okay, moving on. Another example of a limber. This is for the slightly smaller 13-pounder. You can see this has got some labelling up, some hints. 13-pounder, and both the 13-pounder and the 18-pounder referred to as QF or quick fire. And you'll see the letters RHA, Royal Horse Artillery. So they would dash in with some guns, set up near their own infantry, firing on advancing infantry. Similar to the Royal Field Artillery, the Royal Field Artillery a bit slower. But basically at the beginning of World War I, both the Royal Field Artillery and the Royal Horse Artillery were ready to fight the Boer War again. They weren't really set up for fighting a trench war. So there's a few evolutions that came later on as things evolved. As far as I'm aware, there were no photos taken of artillery in use during the Easter Rising. Contrast that with the opening shots of the Civil War and the several shots of artillery being used. We see here by Nelson's Pillar, they're digging up part of the road to put the spade in. Again, goes back to what I was saying about recoil. That will increase the elevation. But you can see this gun is set up quite flat at the moment. Similarly with this one over here, the breech has been raised up, lowers the barrel. So this is quite a low trajectory, firing over at the forecourts. And while the gun has a shield, it doesn't offer that much protection. So in this photo in particular, you can see that 2 Lancia armored personnel carriers are being used to provide some cover. And the guys here don't use rifles and what have you. So you've got some other guy here with a Lewis gun providing some protection. Really sure there's any much more to say there, other than Civil War, they didn't use horses. The guns were pulled by Lancia vehicles and whatever other vehicles were available. Back at France and Flanders, typical setup here is 1 gun detachment. So you've got the limber here with 2 crew on board, 6 horses, 3 men on the left-hand side of the horse, and you would have a senior NTO as the number 1. So making the gun crew would be 6, but you'd have another 4 in the detachment looking after another wagon, other horses, etc., and they would provide cover if one of the main crew was injured or killed. Slightly later photo, this I think is about 1939, 38, but it gives an indication of how the crew would operate. Number 1, in charge of the gun, responsible for its the crew, maintenance, all of that sort of stuff when it's not in use, and then for giving fire orders, etc., when it is in a combat situation. 2 and 3, they would generally sit on the limber, and they are responsible for sighting, getting the breech open shut, and then firing the gun. And then these guys are basically responsible for getting the ammunition prepared and handing over to the crew for firing. And you'll see this guy here, he is carrying one of the 18-pounder shells. You'll see he's got it in one hand and it's just resting on his knee. You'll notice he's not Superman, bodybuilder, or anything like that, just an ordinary guy. So this shell, while it's heavy, it's not requiring lifting gear or anything like that. It's relatively easy for one person to hold it, pass it along the line, into the breech, close the breech, fire it. This gun is also a slightly later gun. You can see it's got 2 tails here leading into the hook for attaching to the limber, and the spade here as well. What that means is that the breech can depress further down, and it means the barrel can be elevated higher, and that means that it can fire slightly further. So this is, I think, a Mark IV gun, introduced about 1918, and I think that increased the range of the gun by about 1,500 yards, something of that order. But even in 1938, 39, the setup was fairly similar. Ammunition carried in a limber to the left of the gun. Not a lot of protection for the crew in this setup, other than these 2 operating the gun. Pre-1916, guys have no helmets on. Helmets weren't really introduced until the Battle of Somme around July 1916. What you see here is guys getting the fuse ready. This guy here is then loading a shell into the breech. He doesn't look like he's having a lot of difficulty holding that shell. It's not too heavy. That'll go in there and be fired off. This is what the early shells looked like. So you've got a bit of brass here. You've got the shell here, and then you've got the fuse at the top. And this cross-section shows that the brass was filled with some strands of what's called cordite. That would provide the explosive power to push the shell out through the barrel. This would be retained, kicked out the breech on firing, or after firing. Firing pin at the end here, which would cause this to ignite, explode, send this shell careering over towards a target. And at the beginning of the war, that target would most likely have been advancing infantry or cavalry. You'll see all these balls in here, look like old style musket balls. They would explode above advancing infantry or cavalry in a circular pattern, and basically cause lots of wounds, deaths, etc. It wasn't intended to blow up trenches. It wasn't intended to blow up buildings, tanks, anything like that. There were no tanks in 1914-15. So this was really aimed at destroying your enemy, either killing them or wounding them and incapacitating them. Yeah, still quite a lethal. But you can imagine if a shell like this is being propelled from a gun and hits a building, it will knock out bricks, it will knock out windows without any problem. And if you're a horse or a person standing in front of it, it's going to be a little bit messy. But the primary purpose of these shells is to fire these shrapnel pieces, as well as the outer shell, to cause harm to infantry and to cavalry. I'll also just add that during the period 1914-15, quickly realized that high explosive was needed, and in 1915 a lot more high explosive was being pumped into guns. But in Ireland, for training purposes, the shells made available to the troops were these shrapnel shells. So you hear that incendiary shells being used in Dublin during the Easter Rising. That's a myth. There were no incendiary shells, full stop, for the 18-pounder in 1916. There were just these shrapnel shells, and then later more of the high explosives. But in Dublin, it was predominantly the shrapnel shells. Okay, you also hear the 18-pounders being referred to as heavy artillery. And again, just to put that in context, an 18-pounder shell, the explosive piece, is smaller than this one here. So if this is heavy, these are medium, we're definitely going into the realm of light artillery. So if you're hearing anything about heavy artillery, just in relation to the Easter Rising, it's a no. The 18-pounders would be considered as light infantry or light artillery, not heavy artillery. If you're lucky enough to get to Dublin and to wander around Collins Barracks, the National Museum, you will see an 18-pounder of sorts on display. And I say of sorts, it's in amongst the mix of 1916 paraphernalia, etc. However, this version of the 18-pounder would not have been around in 1916 and would not have been used in the Easter Rising. So yeah, sort of right caliber, but the wrong mark. This is a Mark IV, and you can see that the barrel is above the metalwork for the recoil manager. And if you're able to look at the rear, you'll see it has the two tails, and the breech can depress further and elevate the barrel higher. So while these were 18-pounders and they were used towards the tail end of World War I, this is not the sort of artillery piece that would have been used in Dublin in the Easter Rising. So just to go back and reiterate the two myths trying to pull out here. One, there was no heavy artillery in Dublin during the Easter Rising. It was light artillery. And myth two, there were no incendiary shells. There were shrapnel shells. And while it would be true to say that those shrapnel balls and the outer shell would get hot when exploded, they weren't there to cause fires. They may have caused fires if they touched on flammable material, but no, there were no incendiary shells. And then just to highlight what I was saying there about the museum in Dublin, great little museum. Some of the pieces, a little bit questionable about the context, etc. So it's also always worthwhile going in, having a look around, etc. But just be aware that you're not always being told the right thing, or you're not being presented with the right context. So yes, £18 a gun, but it's not the sort of gun that would have been used in 1916. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Hope that was useful.